Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your baby can understand words spoken with a funny accent? Well, this new study might have a clue. Ever met someone with a really different way of speaking and you just couldn't understand them at first? It is like their words are jumbled up, right? This often happens with foreign accents. We usually think these unfamiliar sounds make it hard for anyone to understand, especially for super young kids who are just learning language. This study dives into whether little toddlers can actually get used to new accents pretty quickly, even if they only hear them for a little while. The researchers here were asking a big question. Can toddlers, who are just starting to learn words, actually understand words when they're spoken in an accent they've never heard before? And if they can, how much exposure do they need? They found something really surprising. Even after less than 2 minutes of hearing a new accent, 24-month-olds, so almost 2 years old, could learn new words spoken in that unfamiliar accent. This shows how amazing our brains are at figuring out speech, even when it is not perfectly clear or familiar. You see, normally when we hear a voice that sounds different from what we're used to, it takes a bit more effort to understand. Think about it. If you grew up hearing one way of saying water, and then you hear someone say it completely differently, your brain has to work a little harder to map that sound to the word water. This has been shown to be true for babies, young kids, and even adults. The researchers mentioned that studies show 9-month-old infants struggle to recognize words if they're spoken in a different accent than what they've heard before. Even 24-month-olds, the same age group in this study, couldn't recognize a new word they had just learned when it was spoken in a foreign accent. So, the big idea is, if accents make it so hard, how do we ever learn to understand different people, especially in today's world where we hear so many different voices? So, how did they test this? They worked with 24-month-old toddlers. They divided them into 4 groups. Each group had a slightly different experience before the main word learning task. For about 2 minutes, the toddlers in one group heard a few short stories with a local accent, the kind they likely heard at home, spoken by just one person. Another group heard the same type of stories but from multiple local speakers. Then 2 more groups heard similar stories, but spoken with a foreign accent, specifically Spanish accented English, which is quite different from typical American English. One of these groups heard it from a single speaker, and the other heard it from multiple speakers. They did this for just under 2 minutes. This exposure phase was designed to mimic how kids might naturally hear different voices. After this short exposure, the real test began. They used something called the preferential looking procedure. Imagine a toddler sitting on their parent's lap, watching a screen. When a word is spoken, they show pictures, and the researchers see what the toddler looks at. This helps them figure out if the toddler understands the word. They taught the toddlers new, made, up words for made-up objects. They used a native English speaker to teach them these words. Then, here is the crucial part, they tested the toddlers using a Spanish accented English speaker. So, the toddlers heard the new word and had to choose between the object they were just taught and a new object. If they looked at the correct object when they heard the word, it meant they recognized it. And here is where it gets really interesting. Remember those 4 groups? The toddlers who had only heard the local accent spoken by one person struggled to recognize the words when spoken in the foreign accent. This was expected based on previous research, but the magic happened in the groups that heard the foreign accent during their brief exposure. The results showed a clear difference. When toddlers had heard the foreign accent, even for just those 2 minutes, they were much better at recognizing the newly learned words when they were spoken by the Spanish accented speaker. So, what does this mean in simple terms? It means that even a tiny bit of exposure to an unfamiliar accent helped these toddlers overcome the difficulty of understanding words spoken in that accent. The researchers found that the toddlers who heard the foreign accent performed better than those who only heard the native accent. Interestingly, whether they heard one speaker or multiple speakers, in the exposure phase didn't make as big of a difference as simply hearing the foreign accent itself. The key was that exposure to the foreign accent, even for a short time, helped them adapt. This study really highlights how adaptable young children's minds are. They don't need years of immersion to start understanding different ways of speaking. The researchers suggest there might be 2 ways we learn to cope with new accents. One way, which they call the lexically based specific expansion strategy, is like learning specific rules for each sound change. This is good when you have lots of clear examples. But for natural accents which have many changes at once, this might be too much for a toddler. The second strategy they talk about is general expansion. This is like your brain saying, okay, this person sounds a little different, so I am going to loosen my expectations a bit and try.